I am here today trying to paint up some CIS units. I have some B2 battle droids that are already primed and ready to paint. And then I have this one that I always keep a step or two ahead of the process, so I understand where it's going. I've previously painted a few others. I've got my B1s started. I might get to some crab droids later, but probably not today. The thing that I think makes Star Wars so fertile as a subject and as a source of things like this is, I mean, obviously it was 40K before 40K in that it was a pop culture amalgamation of the imaginative results of many different franchises. So there's that aspect. But I think what makes Star Wars so good is it can have a non-satirical mirror for real world events. And obviously the designers of things like this game and contemporary TV shows understand that. I think it's no secret that, it's no mystery why, and this is one of my more recent projects, but my Imperial Army now contains soldiers with riot shields, right? This is a project that I didn't get a chance to film because it was done while moving. These guys are going to be now leading my forces into battle. They're going to be accompanied with, and this one's unfinished, but they're going to be accompanied by this guy as an upgrade instead of as a hero, which is fun. I like that. But that's not what I'm here to paint today. I'm here to start painting CIS. But the reason why I think it's interesting that we want stormtroopers with riot shields is because that's where our society most encounters with both authoritarianism, but also the specter of liminal authoritarianism. Riot shields are an important part of any police force that operates in a city. But they're a symbol to us. They're a symbol to that situation where it becomes the people versus the state, right? And because in our time we have so many highly publicized and vivid pictures of riot shields in action, it feels appropriate that our depictions of the Empire would have that now. So here they are in the game. You've seen them in shows and things too. The riot trooper. But what I'm interested in is the CIS. I haven't painted the CIS in this game yet, partially because I started with the classic factions and I wanted to keep a collection that could play itself, So it's nice to have a Republic and an Empire collection, and I based them to make it look like they could theoretically be fighting each other. I think that's fun. You can have a friend over and teach them the game in a way that makes sense. But I'm branching out into the CIS for a couple different reasons, and maybe I'll explore that as this goes on, but the one that interests me is the idea of the CIS interests me, right? So they come from the Clone Wars, and the Clone Wars is a significantly less inspiring conflict than the Galactic Civil War. In the Galactic Civil War, both sides they're both fighting for something they believe in, and the stakes are real, right? In the Clone Wars, there are people who believe in what they're fighting for, and I'll explore that. But the most interesting thing about the Clone Wars is that it's a fake conflict. It's manufactured. The armies are fake. So the planets who side with the Republic, they do have professional soldiers that are recruited from those planets, usually for the officers, right? But as we all know, the ground forces are the clone troopers. They are clone troopers that do not cost anyone in the galaxy anything to create. They are funded through financing. Financing that is secured through politics, through the political efforts of the Chancellor Palpatine, who obviously is the one orchestrating everything, but also just through political machinations. So the Republic financializes the entire war, And then the clones themselves are not recruited on any planet. They're no one's son or father. The clones are a fake armed force that is just acquirable and easily sent out. This insulates the people from the effects of the war. We see something a little bit similar in two of the world's superpowers today. In the war in Ukraine right now, the majority of the Russian soldiers that are used in frontline action are recruited from politically unimportant or backwater or ethnically different parts of Russia. And as a result, the staggering casualties that the Russians are experiencing, the high price of their desire to acquire Ukraine, is paid by people who are politically insulated from Russian politics. Now, that's increasingly less and less the case. It was definitely the case for the first few years of the war, and it's still largely the case now. But that's what's happening in the Clone Wars. The people of the Republic and the CIS, we'll talk about them in a second, but the people of the Republic in particular do not have their people going out into conflict. It's the clones. And they're able to financialize the war. And this is where we have to bring in the example of a different superpower today. This is how the United States fights its wars. Wars are very expensive, even for the United States, perhaps even especially for the United States, because we like to do things well, which translates to expensively. We want to use the discombobulator on you when we attack so that we don't lose soldiers. Maybe this is how democracies fight. Maybe democracies just don't like their people dying in war. And yet, Russia is using similar tricks. So maybe it's not just the democracy aspect of things. However, what that means is that we spend a lot of money, and you would think that this would then create a political constraint on the war. But this is where Star Wars gives us another angle to consider modern warfare, because U.S. war is largely financialized. We borrow the money for all the conflicts, usually at fairly friendly interest rates. And interest rates we can even influence. The result is that the U.S. can spend just about as much money as it wants to on wars without any effect on the economy. Now, obviously, that's not completely true. There are effects on the economy long term. And a sufficiently expensive government expenditure can affect the economy, as we saw during COVID. Or maybe that's what it was. Maybe it was something else. I'm not an economist. But for most, especially for the era of the war on terror and the optional wars following the unipolar era, the United States is able to basically conduct warfare for more or less free because it has such good credit. The dollar as a reserve currency forms the backbone of the international economy because people trust the independence of the Fed. They trust the stickiness of the U.S. empire. It's not going anywhere. It's always a good bet to buy U.S. bonds. I'm recording this in January of 2026, so let's put an asterisk in that and some of that Fed stuff. But regardless, that is the source of U.S. power. It's called dollar hegemony. The centrality of the dollar to the international system is half of it, the dollar hegemony. The other half of it is the fact that we have political control over most of the world's important financial institutions. This means that access to finance is basically a given, because any circumstance where the U.S. empire is going down is also really bad for all the world's financial bodies. In Star Wars, this concept is explored through the banking clan and the commerce guilds. More the banking clan, from what I understand. Regardless, though, the armies of the Republic, we'll talk about the CIS in a second, but the armies of the Republic can be largely financialized through the political and economic system of the Republic. So the Republic can fight a war that its people don't have to fight in, and that its taxpayers don't have to pay the burden of. It's paid by loans. The nice thing about wartime loans is if you win, you have the resources to pay them off. And if you lose, you probably don't have to pay them off. Unless you lose really well. We'll talk about that in a second, though. Losing is another thing that is made a little bit more difficult by financialization, but we'll discuss that later. Anyway, the point is that the Clone Wars are fake. The people don't feel the cost, because the purpose of the Clone Wars is some shadowy Sith plot to transform the Republic into the Empire by allowing the Chancellor to nationalize all of the problematic worlds and corporations that would oppose the rise of authoritarianism. So let's talk about the CIS a little bit. Who are the groups that the Chancellor sees as his opponents in the rise to authoritarianism? I'll tell you what, they're largely not paragons of democratic representation. They are alternative sources of power in the galaxy. And I think this is what makes the CIS so interesting as a object of games and discussion and subplots in stories. Because the CIS is 100% all the way down a tragic figure. Because the war was fake, but the grievances were not. The Republic seems to prioritize the needs of core planets over periphery planets every single time. In Wallerstein's world systems theory, we have this idea that the world is divided into core and periphery states, and he was thinking largely economically. In Star Wars, it's social, cultural is just as much as economical. But there are some states that produce finished manufactured goods and some states that produce commodities. And as a result, the value extraction flows inward. So steel is cheaper than cars, but cars require steel. So if you have steel producing nations and car producing nations, the car producing nations are buying something cheap and selling something expensive, and the steel producing nations are selling something cheap and buying something expensive because the people there don't need cars. Yeah, it was kind of a simplistic model of the economy. It's not completely correct, but there's some validity to at least the idea of wealth flowing in directions, right? Now, in Star Wars, it's not as much a matter of development. The worlds of the CIS are industrial. However, their societies and economies have not progressed to the level of service and luxury economies. And that's largely because there's one other missing element in the core periphery thing, and that is identity. So the Star Wars galaxy seems to be divided into worlds that are human worlds, which seems like there are many of these worlds that are mostly settled by humans. Then there are worlds that have humans and one major alien species. And then there are worlds that have only one alien species. There are also the diverse ecumenopoli, but I'm not really talking about those. We'll talk about those. We might talk about those in a second, because those are created by very specific economic and political circumstances. But the human worlds are a dime a dozen. Many of them were invented due to, casting simplification choices during the 80s and 70s, when the classic Star Wars films were being made and the stories around them were being told. We think about Alderaan. It's populated by humans. Corellia is populated by humans. And then the xenostates are really easy to operate because they're straight out of Pulp Fiction, you know? They're the planets that are largely populated by one species of alien. So, think about Geonosis. The middle ground, though, is very interesting because there are many planets that seem to have a population of humans living on top of an indigenous alien population. Indigenous alien is a really funny expression, right? That's worth talking about later, but I'm going to keep saying it. Okay. These are planets like Naboo is the classic, right? You have the human communities and you have the Gungan communities. Who do you think, has been on Naboo longer? Anyway, it's interesting. What's even more interesting is the fact that until the events of the Phantom Menace, it was the human community in Naboo that represented them in the Senate that got to call themselves the governing, the state of Naboo. I mean, the queen of Naboo is always a human. It's interesting. What we had there is basically two different ethnostates occupying the same planet. But in the eyes of the Republic, it's the humans that rule. Okay, so this is why it's really fascinating that it is the alien xenostates that form the backbone of the CIS. Now, there's obviously more to it than that, because I've been talking about the CIS and I still haven't mentioned the most important word here. That is the corporations. The CIS seems to be ruled by corporations. Seems to be. Because they actually do have a parliament that is not governed by corporations, but they have a corporate council of world financiers who basically call the shots. Okay. This is because the other thing that Palpatine is trying to do is break the power of corporations in the galaxy. Well, that's not really true, is it? He doesn't want to break the power of corporations. He wants to break the corporations that might oppose his agenda and empower the ones who wouldn't. This is the best evidence we have that the Empire might be called something like fascist or state corporatist, because some corporations are good and some are bad. Anyway, that's a different conversation. Perhaps I've already talked about it before. The CIS, though, is made up of the type of corporations that oppose hegemonic power in the Star Wars galaxy, that would be harmed by the rise of the Empire, that know it and would oppose it. These largely are made up of alien ethno-state-dominated corporations. So, because the Republic systemically excludes aliens from representation, from political power. Obviously, the Xenostate world still get alien senators and all that, and they still participate, and some of them still like the Republic. The Wookiees didn't seem to mind it at all. Regardless, though, it is still the case that the human domination made it so that the main way for Xenostates to maintain their power and representation, and ostensibly, we have to imagine that a big part of this is trying to keep humans off their world, right? How can they get the right to do that? And that is to form and embrace corporations. So behind most of these large Xenostates is a corporation that uses the labor of that alien race, but also represents them politically. The Geonosian corporation is not the same as the state of Geonosis, but they're linked together. The corporation protects the interests of the Geonosian population, but also vice versa. The Geonosian population creates the money for the corporation. This is the arrangement that had developed over many years of the Republic, and this is the relationship that Palpatine wanted to break. So as the Clone Wars went on, conveniently, all the planets that he needed to really attack were the ones that headquartered these corporations, and one by one, the Republic nationalized them. Okay, so what does the CIS really represent then? Well, in one sense, they do represent modern fears about the world. They represent something potentially real. In 1933, apparently, a group of corporations got together and tried to overthrow, or at least explored the idea of overthrowing FDR with a military coup and replacing him with a fascist dictator. The idea was that they could fund it, they just needed someone else to fight the war for them. If we believe the account of Smedley Butler, the man who they tried to recruit to lead the movement, all they needed was an army. So they started looking for a group of military capable people who were angry with the government, a clone army, if you will. Instead, what they found was the bonus army, World War I vets who were disgruntled at the fact that the government didn't pay them the rewards they were supposed to have because of the Great Depression. One of the leaders of this movement was Smedley Butler, a decorated U.S. soldier who fought in the Banana Wars and various other conflicts. They thought maybe he would lead the movement to overthrow the U.S. government. He declined and told the government. The rest is dubious history, because again, most of our knowledge of this comes down to whether or not you believe Smedley. Anyway, the point is, though, it's not completely outlandish to think that a group of corporations might try to overthrow the government, and that fear is what the CIS represents in some sense. But they're also so much different than the Empire, because while the Empire has true ideology and true believers and stormtroopers and this beautiful picture of authoritarian excess, but also humanity, the CIS has none of that. The CIS represents that desire to escape war, the thought that we can, with our technology, avoid war. Because every army the CIS fields is made of products of corporations that are really expendable. So how many plots in the Clone Wars are basically this weird guy came and asked us to give him a fleet, and we did, and now he's attacking the Republic in his own strange, esoteric, vengeance-filled way, right? How does a guy like Admiral Trench, who's just a big spider, keep getting given fleets so then he can throw them away as the villain of the week in the Clone Wars? How does... what the heck is up with General Grievous? But the idea is that the people of the CIS want to be just as insulated as the people of the Republic from the war, because it is a fake war. And so they also need to be given free fake armies that are nobody's kids. Enter the droid army. So the various corporations of the galaxy that represent the Xenostates have, to protect their own interests, because obviously the government's not going to protect their interests for them, have formed private armies to protect their holdings and spaceships at different times. So essentially, all these droids are really made to be Marine forces. They live on spaceships, and then they go fight for you, and then they come back. And all you have to do is recharge them at the end of the day. They're in fact very similar to Smedley Butler. The soldiers who would, Marine soldiers who would fight for the U.S. government in all these conflicts in the Pacific and the Caribbean and Latin America, who would go in, overthrow the unfriendly government, stay there for a week or two, and then get out. You live on a big ship, you disembark, you do some duty, you come back. This is what the droids are meant to be. So as a result, we have these really things that people are always asking why the CIS would build spaceships with seats in it to be filled by droids. Why not just make the whole spaceship a droid? They do that with some of their fighters. Why do the droid tanks have chairs? But the point is that none of this stuff was made for the Clone Wars. These droids are meant to be plug-and-play Marine soldiers for enforcement operations for corporations. The tanks were made by different corporations. And then now the droids are doing their job, plugging and playing in the corporation. In the corporation's army. But in spite of that, in spite of the unreality, in spite of the robot force, in spite of the phony nature of the conflict, in spite of all that, the CIS kind of has a point, don't they? A lot of the things that the rebels would end up fighting about, the CIS had already noticed. The increasing threat of the rise of what would become the Empire, it was all there in the Republic. It was just growing. This is the most interesting thing about the CIS, and this is why I'm so interested in them. Also, when I say that the people of both sides are insulated from the Clone Wars, it's not exactly true, is it? That's just true for the people in the core where the wars largely didn't take place. In fact, the few occasions where they did breach containment, it was a huge deal. And Palpatine only allowed that to happen when he really needed pressure for the war to end. Most of the fighting ended up taking place in the Outer Rim and maybe the Mid-Rim occasionally, but very rarely in the core and the colonies, largely because of that same political power thing, right? The people on the outside are not politically important. People out on the edges don't matter, right? People out there. And so they can bear the brunt of the conflict. And that's kind of what the CIS represents too. Those people tried to avoid war by replacing themselves with machines, but then the war just got brought home to them. It was their worlds who were blockaded. It was their systems who were invaded. And the CIS, in a sense, for all its flaws, for all its war crimes, for all its phoniness, is right. And I think that's what makes them so interesting as villains and people in an organization you might want to buy some minis of and paint, or at least I do, is because when I'm painting them, the whole time I'm thinking about that. And that doesn't even touch on the other way that the CIS ended up becoming really salient to us, because when the prequels were being written, it was right on the heels of the entrance of China into the WTO and the growth of international global capitalism, and there were these fears that our systems and machines were also going to replace us. Fears that the droids kind of represent really mechanistically. It's no accident that one of the most memorable scenes in the Attack of the Clones, which represents the beginning of the Clone Wars, is a long and completely pointless to the plot, chase scene through a large industrial factory that is making these droids, because there's also a story about industrialization here. I mean, these represent the power of corporations to replace people, but also to represent them financially, and it's so interesting. That's what the droid army is all about. But anytime you look too closely at something in the CIS, it does start to fall apart a little bit, because, again, just like the war was fake, also the CIS is kind of fake, because they largely exist as antagonists in the story. And this is where the other aspect of this paint job comes in, because growing up, a very formative experience for me was playing the Republic Commando games, where the droids form very memorable opponents. And so I have altered the sculpts of the battle droids that have been made by Star Wars Legion. I've made them more hunched over, and I've changed the color scheme to represent the droids in that game, because I want also to build the CIS as the correct antagonist. I do plan to get some Geonosians, don't worry. They're in the game, so I can justify it, but also they do represent the heart of all the only things that are good that the CIS can represent. But I want these guys to be the real antagonists. The hunched over, bleached white, bone-looking enemies from that game. That's what I want to build. So I'm working on it. Anyway, the next step is these super battle droids. And if you've played Republic Commando, you know that the super battle droids here are not like depicted like they are in some other media, almost as disposable as these guys. In this game, every super battle droid is a mini boss, and they're terrifying and they're relentless, and they are themselves a representation of that industrial machine power that the CIS also represents. So what I'm doing is I prime them in black, and then I'm undercoating them in this off blue. What is it? It's a Games Workshop thing. It's a Citadel paint. What is it? Cantor blue. I don't know what that means, but anyway, I've coated them in that. And then the idea is then to put a metallic layer over that just lightly suggests the blue underneath, because they do have a bluish hue in the game. And then I'll touch that up with some more details, and then add some corrosion later to it, because in the game they're often dirty and battle damaged and sparking and jittering and just, you know, all sorts of beautiful machine villainy. But I want it to be machine villainy that still helps us to meditate on what the CIS actually represents. It represents the corporation as a political entity. It represents the weird ways that the voice of the marginalized enters into politics. It represents the true villainy of Palpatine's plot, in that he made these people despicable to destroy them. It represents the fear that we all have of corporate power, but also of being replaced by machines. You know, in an age of thinking machines that seem to be more creative than the average person, and are available for more or less free, or at least pennies on the use online, you know, the fears that the CIS represent just couldn't be more salient. But at the same time, I just can't help but be moved by the beauty of the CIS cause and all its villainy and evil.